Hey, Jay, you there? Hi, Jay. How's it going? And Tanya, how are you? Jay, how you feeling?
Good. How are you?
All right, good. No fever, huh?
Nope. I'm all
Uh,
good.
Excellent, excellent. Tanya, is that how I pronounce your name?
Yeah,
Tanya?
it's Tanya.
Tanya? Okay. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing okay.
Great. All right. Well, let's see. Today we were going to cover a little bit on the overview, I think, still. Jay and I had started that yesterday. Before we get going, since Tanya, this is your first time to be here, just want to let you know we're recording this, and you don't have to put your video on there if you don't want to. You can just listen. Um, same for you, Jay, if you want. Um, but I'll be posting any parts of this that have relevance to the course, relevance uh, to the assessment, like quizzes and exams and that sort of thing. Okay. You have any questions about the course or the syllabus so far? Would you like me to answer?
Do we know what days our quizzes are going to be on?
Not yet. I'm trying to group some material right now into a kind of a new quiz. So um, we'll probably do a real short one over this first like overview,
Hmm.
um, and the things that I've given you, just to make sure you kind of get the rounds. It'll be real easy, but it'll give you an intro to taking the quizzes.
Okay.
And then the first real substantive quiz will be over the Norse and the Native Americans. And I still haven't made it clean on the version of the syllabus that you can see. I'm working on it on another page. Um, but that'll be the first real substantive stuff will be, with actual dates and terms and stuff like that. Um, will probably be next week.
Okay.
And I'm going to throw some readings at you here today. But it's not anything too far out of um, far from what we've already talked about. So we'll do some Native American sort of general patterns um, of what we think American Indian populations and their sort of their cultural ecology were at the time of at the time of contact. Um, and um, and then we'll talk also about the Norse, the record of Norse discovery and colonization that we're sure of, we're pretty sure of. And then there's some other theories about possible colonization from China. Maybe you're familiar with that. And but basically, our focus is on North America, really north of Mexico, but somewhat in this first part, we're going to talk a little bit about the influence of the ancient Mesoamerican societies on the South. They they had some serious, important religious and agricultural influences on the southern states, the Gulf Coast mainly. The Gulf Coast, which is inundated by water this morning, right? Or at least part of it. Um, well, so then yeah, it'll that'll be the first substantive one, and then the third quiz that'll be worth uh, a regular amount and it'll be pretty significant. Will be over what we call the Spanish borderlands, and the Nostrand has one reading in this, as you know, and he is kind of that's kind of his area of research. Dick Nostrand is a professor down at the University of Oklahoma. He's a historical geographer. He's retired. He's in his 80s now. Still very spry and an interesting guy. Um, but he's done a lot of work on the Pueblo groups, and not the Pueblo groups, but the Hispano or the Spanish American villages in that same area of the Upper Rio Grande Valley. And so we'll talk about Hispano-colonization. And John Cross's book on ethnic landscapes will cover that also. So you'll get to see kind of the, we'll in John Cross's book, if you have either of you had a chance to look at that introduction of,
Is that the 20-page document?
yeah. It's an online book, and what I've done is clipped out some chapters and parts of chapters for you. John Cross is a historical geographer, but his focus is on the landscape, and so and the landscapes that have developed over time. So this will actually make the course very relevant to you, even if you're not a history major or really interested in historical stuff, because he will explain the things that you can see today that can be connected back to the processes of the past. So I hope you enjoy that. He's kind of long-winded and he gets into some detail, but I'll do my best to sort of tell you what you need to do, both in writing on the lessons and here when we get to discuss those. So hopefully Monday, when we do this again, you will have a list of items to maybe pick my brain about. And maybe I'll even have some questions that you can, if you don't get them down, then you can ask about, or maybe I'll just cover them. So that's kind of the way, that's sort of the method we go here. Readings, lists of terms, and maybe study questions to look at as you're doing those readings, or maybe after you do the readings. And then a time here live, just kind of like we would be in the classroom, to go over those things and sort of review them, and maybe me introduce some more stuff. But mostly I will not introduce anything new verbally here. If I do, you'll know for sure. So it'll probably just be a screencast presentation that I'll upload to you. So it won't be like interactive so much, but we'll have interactive later. So anyway, yeah, that's a good question. And the first midterm exam is not going to cover really anything more than the introductory stuff that you've already looked at. The American Indian presence, which I'll spend probably all of next week on, and the Spanish borderlands, and then New France. Actually, we may just stop with the Spanish borderlands for the first midterm. I'm not sure if we'll even have time. So we don't want to put off the first midterm, because you're gonna need to kind of have a grade to see how you're doing. So we're gonna probably stop at the Spanish borderlands, and then we'll pick up with the next unit at New France. And I like to talk a lot about the French, particularly the French relationship with the American Indians in Canada, the French colonization of Acadia, what is today Nova Scotia, the colonization of South Louisiana, which I'm very, very interested in myself. I used to live in Louisiana. And so I'll talk about the Creoles and the Acadians who relocated there later. That's way into the future for us, actually. So we're going to still talk about the Acadians for now, but and also the Louisiana and Florida and Texas are in this zone where the French and the Spanish are making they're making overlapping colonization. The Spanish come in, then the French come in, the Spanish take over again, and all the time the Spanish and the French are kind of tenuously along the Gulf Coast. And then the English eventually arrive, and things change a bit. But the French and the Spanish had a very different relationship with American Indians than those people from Northern Europe. Okay, France may be part of Northern Europe, but I'm saying the British Isles and the Low Countries. So that would be the British and the Dutch. particularly, and even the Swedes. But those more northerly countries will be coming into the scene a little bit later. And both of you probably have a good sense of the colonization of the English from American history, right? We cover that a lot. So it's not that I'm downplaying that. I want to emphasize the French and the Spanish relationships, because a lot of times folks are not that familiar with it. But when we do get into the second unit, we'll be talking about not just the English, but we'll be talking about English from different parts of England, right? So they're like the Southerners from around London. There are the folks from Northern England who will come into mostly a different area of the country. There are refugees that have been living in England, and you all know about the Puritans being refugees, right? They were refugees from England who went to the Netherlands, but there were also French refugees who went to England because they were Protestant. So it'll get a little bit more complex. I will spend a lot of time talking about, in the second unit, I'll spend a lot of time talking about the relationship between between changes in English politics and changes and how it's associated with the colonization of the Atlantic seaboard of America. Okay, and what we'll see is some interesting stuff. You'll see that the political and cultural divisions of England that exist in this late medieval period, almost the sort of late Middle Ages, around the 15 and 1600s. I don't know if you want to call the 1600s Middle Ages, but this very, very early era, you'll see relationships between the turbulence in England associated with the Reformation, or both the French counter-revolution or counter-reformation, and also the very turbulent history of the 17th century England. Okay, so the 17th century in England was incredibly interesting, and it just so happens that the English are establishing their colonies in the New World, in America, at this very same time. And the geography, the cultural geography and the economic geography of the Atlantic seaboard wind up having very strong connections to those political events happening in England, which I think is really, you'll find it to be pretty fascinating if you're not already familiar with it. And then, of course, there are sort of the unique places. The Hudson Valley gets established first by the Dutch, and we'll talk about how the Dutch colonized it and what the focus of the Dutch was. What might be not much of a surprise is that the Dutch were kind of the inventors. They were the Low Countries, I should say, the Low Countries where the Dutch are coming from. And the city-states, early city-states in the Low Countries of what is today not just Holland or not just the Netherlands, but also Belgium. Okay, so that area along the north coast of Europe is an area where capitalism gets started in the 1400s, and so the most we could say progressive, forward-looking, capitalistic, trade-oriented country in Europe really is, or the city-states of the Low Countries, and they would embark on their own colonization effort in the New World, and they would focus, of course, on the Caribbean, but also on the Hudson Valley, and they recreated they attempted to recreate what they had and what they perceived that they wanted in the New World. And so we have the development of New Amsterdam, which would of course become New York City. And that becomes an urban focus with an orientation toward the rest of the world and less so toward the interior. Just like Amsterdam and Rotterdam and Antwerp. So the area that that different groups arrive to is often perceived in the way that they're thinking. So it's very different from, say, the English who would arrive at Plymouth. Who do we call those folks? We usually refer to them as the Pilgrims, right?
Yeah.
They were separatists, but then later the Puritans would arrive. And so we'll have a very different type of settlement going on up there in Massachusetts. And then those folks would expand out to other parts of New England. But they were family focused, so that their populations grew quickly, and they were not, they initially were trying to be farmers, subsistence farmers, but they found that the environment wasn't very conducive to farming. After a while, agriculture was outcompeted from other places like the Hudson Valley and later Pennsylvania. And so the New Englanders, although they arrived with ideas of creating a New England and an England that was pure, right, that was without all of its problems, at least without all of its issues associated with the rivalry between the Puritans and the Anglicans and so on, and the Crown. But they would have to become oriented towards the rest of the world. They would have to become oriented toward the sea, and so we begin to see not just fishing and whaling, but later whaling. We'll begin to see things like the development of mercantile trade connections with England. So they're very, very commercial there. And okay, so I could go on and on, but in this, we'll cover in the second part, we'll look at New England and its relationship with England. We'll talk about Virginia and the Virginia Tidewater and its relationship with England as England's going through this very turbulent period of the 1600s, late 1500s, mid 1500s to late 1600s. And then we'll eventually get to, we'll start looking at the very earliest stages of the Carolinas that kind of emerge at this time. The last part of the course, and of course we'll have a midterm, the last part of the course is going to be the one that ties all of this early colonial stuff to the sort of the transformation of an inward-looking society, or a set of inward-looking societies. That's one thing I want to bring out in this course, is that, our motto in the United States, right, is e pluribus unum, right? One from many. And that's really true when you look at the historical geography, that these were very separate, in some cases very isolated societies that had grown up in a certain environmental context from, often still hurting from political events that were taking place in the homeland. And those things that get established in that new place often develop and direct the development of the society. Even though they may become archaic, they may become irrelevant in the homeland, okay? And so we see all kinds of interesting, weird things. Some are less significant, some are sort of mundane, like, for example, the Acadians, who will come from northwestern France, mostly northwestern France, and colonize Nova Scotia, the area around the Bay of Fundy, in the early 1600s, really. They get established and they're pretty much left alone. They're kind of like, you know, allowed to, you know, exist on a in isolation, all, you know, all by themselves, and they wind up interacting with American Indian peoples on Nova Scotia, and they develop this folk culture, and their their version of French becomes, you know, engulfs language, American Indian languages, but and then their language kind of evolves, and their culture evolves, and by the time the English take over the place, this is a separate ethnic group. They've experienced what we might call ethnogenesis. They've experienced this transformation, and then when they would seek refuge elsewhere, a lot of those Acadians, and this happens in the 1750s, much later down the road. When this happens in the 1750s, they go off to the Caribbean. A lot of them go to France. And I don't want to say back to France because they're several generations removed from France. They don't know France. France is not part of their life. France is not, you know, so they arrive back in France, and they're like aliens. Although they speak an archaic version, you know, they speak an old version of French. And then a lot of them, of course, would go to South Louisiana, and they wound up in the area west of New Orleans in South Louisiana, and are largely separate from the culture of New Orleans, which is far more worldly and sophisticated and educated and commercial. And you have this Cajun culture to the west, which is isolated in the, you know, in the swamplands of the lower Mississippi distributaries, Bayou Teche, Bayou Lafourche, all of these areas of what we call the basin. Okay, Appalachia Basin. Okay, I can never pronounce it correct the first time. Anyway, so they continue on this. The Cajuns continue on this subsistence, self-sufficient, you know, sort of in a bubble region, and they continue to develop these their own folk culture, and their folk culture is very durable, very strong, and there's really not much of a connection with New Orleans. So remember that next time you go to a restaurant and they're talking about New Orleans cuisine and they call it Cajun, it's a mistake. It's wrong. Okay, so that's kind of the mundane stuff, right? And we'll look. Hopefully, we'll have time to look at some of the folk culture and some of the material culture that develops. You'll see that in John Cross's readings. He'll talk a lot about material culture and the building, the house types, and the other facets of living off the land that these ethnic groups develop. Well, as I was rambling along there, something popped up that I wanted to cover, and that is, you know, we are in geography and history are complementary disciplines, and we're both sort of analogous. I think Nostrand calls us sort of analogous disciplines. In history, we know that we look at things through time. Okay, we look at events through time. We look at personalities in time. And historians will frequently categorize history in periods. Okay, so that's something you're probably familiar with, right? What's a typical historical period? Like maybe you would take a college course in a history level college course. What would it be called?
Renaissance. Or
Renaissance. Yeah, Renaissance and Reformation, maybe something like that. Maybe what's one of the more popular history courses I've seen this semester is the Vietnam War. Okay, so when would the Vietnam War class begin and end? Well, I don't know. It certainly would begin in 1954, but probably way before that. So there's probably a contextual development of, you got to understand how Indochina was colonized by the French, and then how that colonization sort of got beat up by World War II, and then the events following World War II that led to the involvement of the French in the decolonization of Southeast Asia. So then, of course, comes the United States gets involved in the 1950s and eventually heavily in the 1960s. So and then of course the Vietnam War ends, and that the period that it would end would be 1975. But then again, you have the the boat people who are leaving, and then the ability for people to immigrate in 1979. So even though there's the war, you've got that context on either side, right? So you understand what the implications of it are. In geography, we have something very similar to periods, historical periods, and we call them regions. Okay, regions are geographers' way of sort of making sense out of their canvas, which is not time but space. When I say space, I mean the surface of the Earth. So, and mostly the land surface of the Earth, right? So our medium and our most important tool are maps. So map, okay? So this is a really important facet of geography, is that we begin to regionalize. So this class is largely it's very, very difficult. Okay, I'm going to say it's really, really difficult to organize a course that's both historical and geographical at the same time. And I've tried to do it, but it just doesn't work real well. It makes more sense to me to look at regions and kind of consider those regions through a far longer period of time. So our emphasis here, except for the first couple of units, the first lessons, where we're going to be talking about continental scale stuff, because we really don't know that much about American Indian patterns prior to about the 1750s. We really don't know that much about the interior. So we're going to be talking about the eastern seaboard a lot, and the Gulf Coast, and a little bit on the interior. But our time is largely from about 1600 to about 1800. Okay, so a couple hundred years, maybe in the case of some areas 1550s to about 1800. So just for the sake of economy and to make it a little easier to understand, this is why I'm going to focus a bit longer on regions and try to bring them all the way up to the present, rather than covering several regions over a period of time and then jumping up to another period and covering the same regions for another period of time. You can do that, but it often gets messy and is not as easy to understand. So when we get to the Spanish borderlands soon, we'll be talking about the initial entry of the Spanish explorers into the Gulf Coast, into the Caribbean. The conquest of Mexico is relevant to a degree, but even more so is the expansion of the Spanish Empire and the viceroyalty of New Spain, what we call Mexico. So the expansion of the Spanish Empire into the viceroyalty of New Spain throws things off balance among the native peoples. And so we'll look at that. We'll look at the development of the Spanish system of settlement. And again, unlike history, where personalities and events and politics take center stage, they don't here. Okay, generally they don't. In this course, you'll see things happening very slowly. So it's very, like my lectures, very slowly. So, you know, and what we're interested in are not so much events, but processes. Okay, you know the difference? So in the case of events, you might have the, you know, what, 1517 to 1519, Hernan Cortez basically conquers the Aztecs, right? And it conquers the Valley of Mexico. And it's an amazing event. It's an incredible story. It's a fantastic, wonderful story. Well, it's not wonderful, but it's sad and it's amazing. But that's not really what our focus is. We're going to look at things like processes in which, well, let's not talk about the establishment really of a fortress. Let's talk about the process that the Spanish used, and let's understand the ideology behind the processes that led the Spanish into the northern part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, to, you know, eventually reach all the way up to the Rio Grande Valley, into southern Colorado, or into the desert, the Sonoran Desert, into what is today Arizona, or to go along the coast very late into the 1700s and establish missions and presidios and civil communities in California. And I missed the whole, you know, I didn't even talk about the Gulf Coast. So, you know, it's establishing Texas. And so we'll look at the region through time, probably take it all the way up to 1800. So you have a good idea of those regions. And another thing I will emphasize is the development of core areas. And what I mean by that is those areas that are the sort of the focus of the region, and the areas that administer the region. And so in this sense, you're getting kind of what we might think of as kind of a physiology course of the region, of the culture region. We have different types of regions in geography. If you've had any, Tanya, you've had a lot of geography?
I think I took like one geography class.
Would it be
So
11,
it was
14?
Yeah, I was just like,
Physical?
yeah.
Okay.
Oh wait, no, I didn't. I took
Cultural?
I took cultural, physical, and then there's another one.
Regional? World regional?
Oh yeah, regional. I forgot I
You've
took
had
all
a
those
lot of-
classes.
Okay, you've had a lot of geography.
I was just thinking
You've
about
had
cultural.
times as much geography as anybody. Okay. All right. Anyway, so you've had a lot of geography. If you've had geography 1113 or 1713, or maybe it was even 2253 way back when, then you know about formal regions and functional regions, vernacular regions. Remember that? Formal regions are just areas that have commonalities in some way. Functional regions are regions that can be defined by their interaction or their administration across places. Like the state of Oklahoma is a good example of a functional region. It has a capital, Oklahoma City. It has boundaries. So when you cross the boundary on I-40, you know, heading toward Amarillo, when you cross that boundary from Sayre, Oklahoma, over toward Shamrock, Texas, okay, that boundary, you know, this Oklahoma Highway Patrol doesn't go across onto the Texas side and catch speeders, right? So they have to stay on the other side of the boundary. So the boundaries make for organization. Within the state, you have counties, right? And those counties are other administrative, those are also functional regions. What's the center core of the county?
County seat.
County seat, okay? And within the counties, you have municipalities. You have other small little regions within those, like Stillwater. And so you have administrative and maybe commercial centers of those municipalities. So in Stillwater, you're going to have probably, you know, you think of it, well, OSU is very important within Stillwater, but then Stillwater has its own commercial and even manufacturing base. And so anyway, so those are, they're at different scales, whether we're looking at it, we're looking at the whole state of Oklahoma, or if we're looking at a county or a municipality, or even a college campus, we're changing scales. And so when we're looking at something from, way out in space where the detail is not visible and everything kind of blends together, that's what we usually refer to as kind of a small scale analysis. It's small scale in the sense that there's not a lot of detail. When we look at something in the large scale sense, we're looking at something up close and personal. Well, in this class, we're going to be maybe looking at some places, but generally we're going to be trying to stay very general with the region, okay? But within any region, there are going to be variations. So, and you'll find that the Spanish borderlands have a huge amount of variety. And that's one of the reasons perhaps why there was an uneven degree of success among those different parts of the Spanish Empire north of Mexico, Florida, for example. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about how we organize things. I'm also going to talk a little bit about, and Dr. Nostrand does this in each of his chapters. You're going to read all or part of 9 chapters in that textbook. And even though you bought that textbook and you think, oh, well, I won't get to read it all. Well, if you want to take the sequel to this class, we're using the same book. So we just continue on, and it gets better. The focus is mostly on the United States after this course. Anyway, I'll talk about scholars within geography, and it's not so much to, show off people that we think are important in my field, but it's to largely show you the ideas that they have brought into our discipline. So there are some really important folks, and that first overview has a little biographical sketch on Don Meinig, Donald W. Meinig, or D.W. Meinig. And he's probably the most prolific writer of historical geography within the discipline of geography today. So he has a incredible, I don't have them handy here, but there's an incredible 4-volume set of his writing on the development of the of America, of North America, and mostly it's the United States, that he went through region by region and then time. So he tried to do what is very, very difficult, and that is to tell a story about the development of regions, and then jump into different periods. And so each book has periods within it, and there are 4 volumes. So it's a difficult, long journey to get through all that. But I'll bring out some of the highlights of that series. In fact, so some of the maps that you'll see, in fact, a lot of the maps that you'll see actually come from that 4-volume set. Although we'll only have to bother with the first volume in this course. All right, so and his maps are really, really interesting, and they spark a lot of questions, and they have a lot of ideas in the visual sense. We'll talk about Harlan Barrows, and I've got some readings for you from H.H. Barrows. He was kind of a lot of people call him kind of the father of American historical geography. He was a professor in at the University of Chicago before World War II, from the turn of the century until about World War II. And he had he's the one who shaped the careers of a lot of these people who call themselves historical geographers. There aren't that many of them, but the Chicago school would be very, very important in the development of academic historical geography. And so I'm going to give you he actually has some, his lectures were transcribed. So, and they've been edited a little bit, but not much. So I'll let you see some of those, and they're interesting, and we'll talk about those readings. They're kind of, when you look at the titles are kind of deceiving, like you know, the North America as a fur trading region or something like that. And so, you know, but there's more than that to it when you read it. Carl Sauer is the one geographer who he was educated at Chicago, and he went on to establish what we call the Berkeley School at the University of California at Berkeley. And that geography department became a really influential geography department during the middle part of the 20th century. Lots and lots of folks who called themselves historical geographers came out of that tradition. Now, Sauer was very different. He was kind of a German American from the Ozarks of Missouri. He was from this, you know, area not too far away from us. But what he did was he challenged a lot of the ideas of his time. And even as a student, he was very much a skeptic. And he's largely credited with eliminating from geography the ideology that developed in the late 19th century and continued on into the 1920s that became known as environmental determinism. Okay, any of you heard of that one? I bet Tanya has heard of it. If you took cultural geography, maybe you heard of it. But you familiar with it, Jay? Okay. What's
Yeah,
that?
I can give you a working definition, but I know I've heard it before.
Go for it. No, give me I'd like to hear it.
Oh, I said I couldn't, but I think it's just like considering determinism is just kind of like a destiny for something, just like what we think this environment should be used for. Is it near that?
It's a little bit more than that. This ideology in geography was not exclusive to geography. It was actually something that came out of anthropology or ethnography, and sort of what were the social sciences of the 19th century, which, you know, they were just then developing. And one of the first big ideas was the attempt by social scientists, people who called themselves social scientists, and I suppose psychology might be to blame too. I'm not sure. There are probably a lot of different disciplines that were involved with this, but they were so kind of enamored or maybe even threatened by the breakthroughs in the biology, the breakthroughs with you know, the evolution of the species by natural selection, by Darwinianism, and so you've probably heard of the term social Darwinism. Sometimes sociologists use that term. It's sort of the geographical version of social Darwinism. It's the idea that human cultures are the products of their natural environment, and that means that you know, different natural environments give forth to different cultures. Okay. Now, you might say that's a really general statement, and maybe to some degree you might see some truth in that. All of us have to adapt to our environment, even though, you know, despite the very high level of technology we might have, but we all have to adapt somehow to our environment, right? The idea of environmental determinism actually goes way back in some ways to the ancient Greeks and even the Romans, where they didn't have a lot of information about the rest of the world. They just knew that there were people to the north and there were peoples to the south, you know, other side of the Mediterranean Sea. And they knew that on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea, it was desert, it was really hot, and that the peoples, you know, of the Sahara and south of the Sahara were not at the same level of technology as they were. So they assumed that they were more savages. They were savages, and that they knew that the people who lived far to the north of them, up in the Scandinavian countries, were peoples who had smaller, less developed civilizations in the sense of cities and agriculture and so on. So they kind of considered those northerly peoples to be very different, not really civilized. And so the Romans and the Greeks believed that there must be a happy medium, and they must be the people who were fortunate enough to live in the happy medium, of the Mediterranean mid-latitude climate. And that's part of that whole idea. So once social Darwinism develops, as kind of an offshoot of Darwinian theory and biological theory, you see this idea that, well, cultures must develop out of their natural environment. So peoples who come from the tropics, they must not have the ability to develop large agricultural civilizations, even though today we know that's not necessarily the case with the Maya. And eventually what it came down to was, well, apparently the Europeans have done far more work toward developing a modern civilization than anybody else. So it must be the mid-latitudes that are, that produce civilization. So it went far beyond that. But anyway, Carl Sauer was the one who most criticized that particular mode of thought, which was largely the standard for geography in the 19-teens and into the 1920s. And the way that Carl Sauer sort of laid waste to that mental, that paradigm, if you will, of geography was he said, you can't trust, essentially you can't trust what seems to be apparent. Okay, you cannot assume that patterns exist in space and they've always been like that. And the only way you can really understand is by going and he was influenced by a lot of other folks. He was influenced by historians of Mexico. He was very much influenced by Alfred Kroeber, an anthropologist, ethnologist. He was very much influenced by anthropology, which was very field oriented and becoming more field oriented. So Sauer said, you've just got to go live out in the field. You've got to go live among people to understand what's going on and really know their story intricately in order to begin to try to piece together what's gone on in the past. And you've got to be able to read the landscape that they have. You have to understand how the landscape is used by different cultures. And the only way you can understand that is to ask them and be with them and have them show you and understand it from their point of view. It was part of his ability. So Sauer goes to University of California, Berkeley, and he has this big following of people who, they want to go learn Spanish or they want to go learn an Indian language and, travel down into Mexico on a mule and live several months among native peoples or indigenous peoples or folk peoples, folk societies in northern Mexico, and learn about how they've adapted to their land. So Sauer's, the Berkeley School became associated with what we call cultural ecology, the development of human adaptations to their natural environment, but not just spontaneously. Almost always those adaptations are ideas that have been brought from somewhere else. They've been brought from elsewhere. And they may have been tweaked a little bit and changed somewhat, but their adaptations are can largely be traced back to some earlier period that came from somewhere else. So Most of the technology we have, most of our habits have some connection to our past and have been passed down through us. And maybe we've adopted them. Maybe they weren't our native habits or the native habits of our forefathers, but they've picked those things up. So that's the Berkeley School and Carl Sauer. I just scratched the surface with him. In the remaining few minutes that we have, I want to also mention a very significant idea within historical geography, and that is brought about by a cultural geographer by the name of Wilbur Zielinski. And I don't believe Nostrand discusses Zielinski in much depth. Wilbur Zielinski was a student of the Berkeley School, and he lived throughout much of the 20th century. He died just less than a decade ago. I can't remember exactly when, but I actually got to meet him. Was a very, very really nice fellow. Just a very easygoing, fun person to talk to, but incredibly well read and extremely prolific as a writer. And one of his most important ideas, even though he was a very humble guy and didn't push his ideas much, one of his more important ideas that historical geographers like to tell their students about, okay, is what he called the doctrine, it has a big name, the doctrine of first effective settlement, okay? The doctrine of first effective settlement. And I could read you the formal definition, but the off-the-cuff definition goes something like this. An area that is initially colonized by a group of people, and those people survive, colonization. Those people with their set of cultural items and ideas and ways of doing things, tools, material culture, those people become far more influential in the development of a region than their numbers would seem to appear. So in other words, the earliest settlers into an area, even if those early settlers are displacing displacing indigenous people, which is usually the case in the United States, those people set the pattern. They set the pattern, and other peoples throughout decades, centuries even, other peoples follow that pattern. When they arrive, they typically will follow that pattern. And it's very difficult for that initial pattern to be completely annihilated without any trace of its existence. Now, even the American Indians, even the presence of American Indians had something, the presence of the American Indians kind of set the stage for European colonization. All right. And you'll see examples of this, hopefully bring them out, but you've probably heard of the Puritans arriving into Massachusetts, and where did they decide to settle? You remember? From your American history classes?
Just like in the Massachusetts Bay Area, like Plymouth area.
In general, they actually, they once their population started growing, they started moving out, and they sought out areas that had actually been cleared by Indians in previous years. And so they sought out what they called these old fields, these Indian old fields, because a lot of the native peoples had been either completely dispersed. Many of them, it's assumed, left New England after getting hit very hard by smallpox and by other diseases that were introduced by Europeans, not necessarily the English, but by other groups earlier. And as those populations disappeared, their landscapes became useful to the people arriving. Of course, there's a lot of, you can look at this in other ways. The paths, the trails across, I think I mentioned yesterday, the fur trade, the deerskin trade that began to develop focused on the Savannah River in the Carolinas and Georgia. And that fur trade was a very extensive fur trade into the Southeast. And it was linked to Augusta by not just rivers, but also crossings and also Indian paths, trails. So the Indians had long created their own routes, routes to move to hunting grounds and to trade themselves. And those fur traders followed those. And in fact, our highway systems and our interstates often follow those same routes to a large extent today, at least in that, the certain parts of the country. So the doctrine of first effective settlement is basically that the earliest people into an area tend to set the pattern for events and for processes that will develop there later. And this brings us to the whole idea of what we call cultural hearths. That's Hearths, hearths, like the hearth of a fireplace. Okay, it's kind of a gathering place, and that's kind of where that term comes from. Or you could call it a core, cultural core area. That's sort of the focus of the culture. Okay. What's a state? What's a state that is a southern state? And no question about it, it's a southern state. Is Oklahoma? No, it's kind of spread eagle between the South and the Midwest and the Great Plains and the Southwest, right? Nobody's really sure. But how about Mississippi? Mississippi is about as southern as you get, right? Or Iowa, what region is that in?
Midwest.
It's as Midwest as it gets, right? So it's a core, sort of the core area of those regions. I'm not saying Mississippi is really the core area, but it's definitely part of it. So we will look at the development of these core areas in places like the Massachusetts Bay, okay, which will become the seat, the core, the hearth of the New England culture. Or in the case of the Hispanic Upper Rio Grande Valley, the Santa Fe area. Santa Fe becomes really the sort of the core area for the Hispano homeland that extends not just through most of New Mexico, but into southern Colorado and on down the river, even into the Oklahoma Panhandle historically. So that we'll look at those core areas and their expansion into other regions. And the second and the third part of the course, or excuse me, what we'll see then is the last part of the course is that there are areas that get influenced by those cultural core areas. But first we're going to look at those core areas. We've got 2 minutes left. You all have any questions or anything? I mean, you've been really patient with me today. I'll try to keep it a little bit tighter next time, but we're getting there. Right? Well, I'm glad you two showed up. We've got, I'm not sure how many in this class. We've got over 20, I think. Right? Something like that. Well, I'll see you Monday, I hope. And Jay, I hope you don't have a fever.
Yeah, me too.
He's got COVID-19 positive, right? So hopefully you're one of those folks that don't feel it at all. So
yeah.
And Tanya, you look like you're on campus.
Yeah, I am. I just got back.
You're in Stillwater. Okay. All right. Good for you. All right. Well, I'm in my kitchen, or I'm in my breakfast nook. I'll try to get this looking a little bit better, more like a studio or something for you. I need some better lighting in here.
Well, you got the map up, so that's good.
Yeah, well, I'll have some maps for you on the, what do you call that thing? The share thing.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Over and out. Have a great weekend.
All right.
Stay
Thank you
safe.
too.
All right. Have a good one. Bye-bye.